The impact echoed through the concrete training facility like a gunshot. "Stay down where you belong," Sergeant Kane Harrison snarled, his massive frame towering over the crumpled figure against the metal lockers. The sound of flesh meeting steel had silenced the entire barracks. 290 military recruits frozen mid-conversation, their evening chatter dying in their throats as they witnessed what appeared to be a routine case of bullying escalating into violence. But then Sergeant Harrison's triumphant sneer transformed into a mask of agony, his body folded in half like a broken accordion, a wet crack splitting the air as he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. The woman he'd just slammed into the lockers, all 5 feet 3 inches of her, stood calmly dusting concrete powder from her standard-issue training uniform, her expression as serene as someone who'd just stepped off a Sunday stroll. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Riley Ashford looked down at the writhing 220-pound drill sergeant with the same detached interest she might show a broken piece of equipment. Around them, 290 recruits stood in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what their eyes had just witnessed. One moment, the quiet supply clerk who'd been invisible for 3 months was being brutalized by one of Fort Meridian's most feared instructors. The next moment, that same instructor was on the ground, clutching his ribs, his face purple with pain and shock. "Someone call the medics," Riley said quietly, her voice carrying the same unremarkable tone she used when checking inventory or distributing gear. She stepped over Harrison's prone form without a backward glance, heading toward the exit as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The silence stretched for exactly 7 seconds before chaos erupted. "Holy shit, did you see that? She barely moved. Harrison's ribs are definitely broken. Look at how he's breathing. Who the hell is she?" Riley Ashford had been assigned to Fort Meridian's supply division for 3 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. In that time, she had become a master of invisibility, the kind of person who blended into the background so effectively that most recruits couldn't remember her name, even when she handed them their gear directly. She was small, unremarkable in appearance, with shoulder-length auburn hair, perpetually pulled into a regulation bun, and gray-green eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. Her daily routine never varied. She arrived at the supply depot before dawn, organized equipment with mechanical precision, processed requisitions with quiet efficiency, and disappeared back to her quarters after evening chow. She spoke only when spoken to, maintained perfect military bearing without calling attention to herself, and had never been heard raising her voice above a conversational tone. The other supply personnel had tried including her in their social circles during her first week, but Riley's polite deflections eventually discouraged their efforts. She attended mandatory formations and training sessions, completed physical fitness requirements with unremarkable competence, and otherwise remained as forgettable as government-issued socks. Most recruits knew her only as that quiet supply clerk, or the one who never talks. Some of the more observant soldiers noted that she moved with unusual precision, never bumping into obstacles, never dropping equipment, never appearing hurried even when handling multiple urgent requests. But these were subtle details that barely registered in the controlled chaos of military training. Fort Meridian housed over 3,000 personnel at any given time, making anonymity relatively easy for someone determined to maintain it. The base sprawled across 15,000 acres of Nevada desert, its training facilities designed to transform civilians into soldiers through carefully orchestrated stress and discipline. Competition was fierce, egos were massive, and attention focused on those who stood out, either through exceptional performance or spectacular failure. Riley Ashford had deliberately chosen neither path. Sergeant Kane Harrison, by contrast, was impossible to ignore. At 34, he had built his reputation on intimidation and psychological warfare disguised as military instruction. Standing 6 feet 4 inches and weighing 220 pounds of muscle and attitude, he dominated every space he entered. His voice could shatter glass when he chose to deploy it at full volume, and his cold blue eyes seemed to catalog every weakness in the recruits under his supervision. Harrison had earned his position through a combination of genuine competence and strategic cruelty. He could push soldiers past their breaking points, forge them into effective fighters, and maintain discipline through a mixture of respect and fear. His methods were questionable, but his results were undeniable. Units under his training consistently outperformed their peers in combat readiness evaluations. However, Harrison's approach included a darker element that military leadership either ignored or actively encouraged. He selected targets among the recruits, individuals he deemed weak, unsuitable, or simply convenient for his psychological games. These soldiers received extra attention in the form of verbal abuse, impossible tasks, and carefully orchestrated humiliation designed to either strengthen them or drive them out of the service entirely. For reasons no one fully understood, Harrison had fixated on Riley Ashford, despite her assignment to supply duties rather than combat training. Perhaps her quiet demeanor triggered his predatory instincts, or maybe her refusal to react to his provocations frustrated his need for dominance. Over the past month, his attention had escalated from verbal harassment during equipment distribution to increasingly physical intimidation. The confrontation that had just concluded began like dozens of others. Harrison had cornered Riley near the equipment lockers during evening downtime when most recruits were relaxing in the barracks common area. His opening gambit followed familiar patterns, questioning her competence, mocking her appearance, suggesting she was unsuited for military service. But tonight, something had been different. Perhaps emboldened by his audience of 290 witnesses, Harrison had decided to escalate beyond psychological warfare. The physical assault that followed, slamming Riley into the metal lockers with enough force to dent the steel, was meant to demonstrate absolute dominance, to show every watching recruit what happened to those who didn't properly respect his authority. Instead, it had revealed something that would fundamentally alter the dynamic at Fort Meridian. As medics rushed to tend to Sergeant Harrison's injuries, 3 fractured ribs, possible internal bleeding, and severe respiratory distress, Riley Ashford continued her evening routine as if nothing had happened. She returned to her quarters, completed her equipment maintenance logs, and prepared for the next day's duties with the same methodical care she had always displayed. But in the barracks, 290 recruits were having conversations that would continue deep into the night, analyzing and reanalyzing those few seconds when the impossible had become reality, when the quietest person on base had demonstrated capabilities that defied everything they thought they understood about power, training, and the nature of strength itself. Riley Ashford measured exactly 5 feet 3 inches in her regulation combat boots, weighed 127 pounds soaking wet, and possessed the remarkable ability to become completely invisible in plain sight. At 26 years old, she had perfected the art of existing without being noticed, a skill that served her well in the controlled chaos of Fort Meridian's daily operations. Her personnel file contained the bare minimum of information required by military bureaucracy. Born in Cedar Falls, Iowa, to parents listed simply as deceased. High school graduate with unremarkable grades. No college education. No special skills or certifications. No emergency contacts beyond a distant aunt in Oregon who hadn't spoken to her in over a decade. She had enlisted 3 years earlier, completed basic training with adequate but unremarkable performance, and requested assignment to supply operations, the kind of role that attracted people who preferred structure over spotlight. To everyone at Fort Meridian, Riley was the definition of forgettable. Her auburn hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, so tight it seemed to stretch her features into anonymity. Her gray-green eyes rarely made direct contact with others, instead focusing on clipboards, inventory sheets, or middle distances that allowed her to avoid meaningful interaction. When forced to speak, her voice carried a soft, Midwestern accent that never rose above conversational volume, delivering only the minimum words necessary to complete required communications. The other supply clerks had initially attempted to include Riley in their informal social networks. Sarah Valdez, a cheerful corporal from Texas, had invited her to join evening card games during her first week. "Come on, Ashford," she had said with genuine warmth. "You can't spend every night reorganizing supplies that are already perfectly organized." But Riley's polite deflections, always accompanied by reasonable excuses about maintenance schedules or inventory requirements, eventually discouraged such invitations. Marcus Webb, the supply sergeant who supervised her section, had tried a different approach. A career soldier with 18 years of service, Webb recognized dedication when he saw it, even if he couldn't understand Riley's extreme self-isolation. He attempted to mentor her, offering opportunities for additional training, recommending her for advancement, suggesting she consider specialized roles that might utilize her obvious organizational talents. "Ashford," he had said during one of their monthly evaluations, "you're wasting your potential in basic supply distribution. You could handle logistics coordination, maybe even pursue officer training. Your efficiency ratings are off the charts." But Riley consistently declined such opportunities, expressing satisfaction with her current duties and requesting no changes to her assignment status. What Webb and others didn't realize was that Riley's efficiency stemmed from capabilities far beyond organizational skills. She processed information with computational precision, maintained awareness of her environment that bordered on supernatural, and moved through physical spaces with the fluid economy of motion that came from years of training in disciplines that weren't listed in any military manual. Her daily routine never varied, beginning each morning at 04:45 hours, 15 minutes before required formation. While other soldiers rushed through abbreviated preparations, Riley completed comprehensive equipment checks, physical conditioning, and mental preparation rituals that left her ready for any contingency. She arrived at the supply depot before dawn, not because regulations required it, but because solitude allowed her to work without the constant vigilance that social interaction demanded. The depot itself occupied a massive warehouse complex near Fort Meridian's eastern perimeter, housing everything from basic uniforms to specialized tactical equipment. Riley's assigned section contained small arms accessories, protective gear, and field equipment that required precise inventory control due to security regulations. Her workspace was a monument to organization, every item cataloged, positioned, and maintained according to systems that exceeded military standards. Other soldiers noticed her unusual precision, but interpreted it as obsessive-compulsive tendencies rather than professional competence. They observed how she never seemed to search for items, instead moving directly to required equipment, as if she possessed perfect mental maps of every storage location. They saw how she completed complex requisitions without consulting reference materials, processing dozens of requests daily without errors that plagued less experienced personnel. What they missed were the subtle indicators of capabilities that had nothing to do with supply management. Riley's situational awareness extended far beyond her immediate workspace. She tracked personnel movements throughout the depot, monitored conversations for potential security issues, and maintained constant assessment of environmental factors that might affect operations. Her physical conditioning, while appearing adequate during standard fitness evaluations, actually exceeded requirements by margins that would have drawn unwanted attention if fully displayed. Most significantly, she possessed the kind of calm that only came from extensive experience with genuine stress. While other soldiers struggled with the artificial pressures of military training, drill sergeants screaming impossible deadlines, manufactured crises designed to test psychological resilience, Riley remained unnaturally composed, not because she was naturally unflappable, but because she had encountered real emergencies that made training scenarios seem like minor inconveniences. Her quarters reflected the same careful anonymity as her public persona. The small room contained regulation furniture arranged with mathematical precision, personal items limited to essential toiletries, and a few paperback books with worn covers that suggested frequent reading. No photographs, no decorations, no evidence of life before military service. Visiting personnel, typically other supply staff conducting official business, found the space unsettling in its impersonal perfection. Riley's physical appearance contributed to her invisibility through careful cultivation of unremarkable characteristics. Her auburn hair, while naturally thick and lustrous, was always styled to minimize its visual impact. Her complexion was maintained at regulation standards without enhancement, no makeup, no jewelry beyond required identification tags, no modifications that might distinguish her from thousands of other female soldiers. Her uniform fit properly without calling attention to her physique, which was more athletic than her loose clothing suggested. Years of intensive physical training had developed muscle density and coordination that weren't apparent in casual observation, but provided capabilities that few soldiers possessed. She moved with economic precision that conserved energy while maintaining readiness for immediate action, a gait that appeared unremarkable but allowed her to cover ground efficiently while staying prepared for sudden direction changes or emergency responses. The most telling aspect of Riley's constructed persona was how successfully she had convinced everyone, including herself at times, that this quiet, unremarkable supply clerk represented her true identity. She performed her role with such consistency that the mask had become nearly indistinguishable from reality. She genuinely found satisfaction in organizational tasks, took pride in efficient operations, and preferred solitude to the complicated dynamics of military social structures. But beneath this carefully maintained surface, other aspects of her nature remained dormant rather than extinct. Reflexes that had been honed through experiences far more demanding than supply management, analytical capabilities that could process tactical situations with speed and precision that exceeded anything taught in standard military training, physical skills that transformed her unremarkable frame into something far more dangerous than appearance suggested. These capabilities remained hidden not just from others, but largely from Riley herself. She had constructed her new identity so thoroughly that she rarely thought about the abilities she had deliberately buried. Her subconscious mind maintained them through subtle exercises, disguised as routine activities. Her precise movements served dual purposes of efficiency and conditioning. Her constant environmental awareness functioned as both professional competence and tactical preparedness. Tonight's confrontation with Sergeant Harrison had shattered this carefully maintained equilibrium, forcing dormant abilities back to the surface with an intensity that surprised even Riley herself. The incident marked the end of her successful anonymity and the beginning of questions that would require answers she had hoped never to provide. As she sat in her quarters completing evening maintenance routines, Riley could hear muffled conversations from adjacent rooms, where other soldiers were undoubtedly discussing the events they had witnessed. For 3 months, she had been invisible. Now she had become the center of attention in ways that would make maintaining her constructed identity increasingly difficult. Tomorrow would bring investigations, interviews, and scrutiny that she had spent years learning to avoid. But tonight, she continued her established routines, hoping that consistency might somehow restore the anonymity that had been lost in those few seconds when instinct had overridden carefully maintained restraint. The morning formation at Fort Meridian began at 05:30 hours sharp, with 290 recruits assembling in perfect rectangular formations on the parade ground's weathered asphalt. The pre-dawn air carried the familiar cocktail of dust, diesel exhaust, and anticipation that defined military installations across the globe. Standard procedure called for attendance, accountability, and the daily briefing that would outline training schedules, administrative requirements, and operational updates. Today's formation felt different. Conversations that normally died instantly upon the appearance of senior personnel continued in hushed whispers. Eyes that typically focused straight ahead with military precision kept drifting toward the supply depot complex visible in the distance. Even the most disciplined recruits struggled to maintain their customary stoic expressions, their faces betraying the kind of barely controlled excitement that followed extraordinary events. Riley stood in her assigned position within the support personnel section, maintaining the same perfect posture and neutral expression that had characterized her presence for months. Her uniform displayed no wrinkles, no loose threads, no evidence of the previous evening's confrontation. Her auburn hair remained pulled into its regulation bun with mathematical precision. To casual observation, she appeared exactly as she had every morning since arriving at Fort Meridian. Unremarkable, professional, forgettable. But the dynamics around her had fundamentally shifted. Recruits who had never acknowledged her existence now stole glances in her direction, their curiosity barely contained by military discipline. Personnel who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now found reasons to position themselves where they could observe her reactions to the morning's proceedings. The careful anonymity she had cultivated for months was dissolving under the weight of sudden, unwanted attention. First Sergeant Rodriguez called the formation to attention with his characteristic bark, but even his authoritative presence couldn't entirely suppress the underlying tension that permeated the assembled ranks. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran whose reputation for maintaining discipline was legendary throughout Fort Meridian. He had commanded respect through consistency, fairness, and an uncanny ability to detect problems before they escalated into crises. This morning he faced a situation unlike anything in his extensive experience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying across the parade ground with practiced authority. "Last night's incident in Barracks 7 is under investigation by the appropriate authorities. Any personnel with relevant information will be contacted for interviews. Until that investigation concludes, there will be no speculation, no gossip, and no disruption of normal operations." The silence that followed his announcement was absolute, but charged with unspoken questions. 290 recruits maintained perfect stillness while their minds raced with theories, possibilities, and growing recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Rodriguez continued the daily briefing with professional composure, covering training schedules, equipment maintenance requirements, and administrative deadlines. Physical fitness evaluations would begin at 0800 hours. Weapons qualification would occupy the afternoon training blocks. Evening formation would address new personnel assignments and policy updates. Everything proceeded according to established protocols, creating a facade of normalcy that couldn't quite mask the underlying excitement. Riley listened to the familiar announcements while maintaining awareness of the subtle changes in her environment. Peripheral vision revealed personnel positioning themselves for better observation angles. Audio pickup detected whispered conversations that mentioned her name with increasing frequency. Body language analysis indicated curiosity, speculation, and growing recognition that the quiet supply clerk possessed capabilities that defied conventional assessment. The morning's first training period involved weapons maintenance in the armory complex, where recruits learned to disassemble, clean, and reassemble their assigned firearms under the supervision of qualified instructors. This routine activity typically generated minimal excitement, soldiers methodically working through established procedures while instructors provided guidance and correction. Today's session buzzed with unusual energy, as personnel found excuses to discuss the previous evening's events while pretending to focus on their assigned tasks. "Did you see how fast she moved?" whispered Private Johnson to his maintenance partner. Harrison didn't even realize what hit him until he was on the ground. "She barely looked like she was trying," replied Private Martinez, disassembling his rifle with distracted movements, "like she was swatting a fly or something." Similar conversations occurred throughout the armory, each group of recruits analyzing and reanalyzing the brief confrontation they had witnessed. Details became magnified through repetition. Theories grew more elaborate with each telling. The consensus emerged that Riley Ashford possessed training or experience far beyond anything suggested by her official assignment. Instructor Sergeant Collins, a combat veteran with 2 overseas deployments, noticed the distraction immediately. Collins had seen enough real violence to recognize the difference between lucky accident and professional competence. The previous evening, he had observed Riley's movements with trained eyes, noting details that escaped less experienced personnel. "Ashford," he called out, causing conversations to halt abruptly throughout the armory. "Demonstrate proper firing pin inspection procedure for the group." Riley approached the demonstration table with the same unremarkable composure she displayed during routine activities. Her hands moved through the required procedures with mechanical precision, field stripping the weapon, examining components for wear or damage, reassembling with efficient movements that completed the task in minimum time. But Collins watched more carefully than the manual required. He observed how Riley handled the firearm with familiarity that extended beyond basic training, how her fingers found components without visual confirmation, how she maintained awareness of her surroundings even while focused on detailed mechanical tasks. These were subtle indicators of experience that couldn't be faked or learned through standard instruction. "Outstanding technique," Collins announced to the assembled recruits. "Notice how Ashford maintains proper safety protocols while working efficiently through required procedures. This is the standard we expect from all personnel." The compliment was routine, but delivery carried undertones that suggested deeper recognition. Collins had identified competence that exceeded normal expectations, even if he couldn't yet understand its source or implications. The afternoon physical training session provided additional opportunities for observation as personnel engaged in routine conditioning exercises. Push-ups, sit-ups, distance running, and obstacle course navigation were standard requirements designed to maintain fitness levels adequate for military service. Most recruits approached these activities with varying degrees of enthusiasm and competence, depending on their natural athletic ability and conditioning history. Riley participated in physical training with the same measured approach she applied to all activities, meeting requirements without exceeding them, maintaining adequate performance without drawing attention through exceptional achievement. Her times were respectable but unremarkable. Her form was correct but not outstanding. Her endurance met standards without suggesting unusual conditioning. But trained observers noticed details that casual watching missed. Her breathing remained controlled throughout demanding exercises. Her movements displayed economy that conserved energy while maintaining effectiveness. Her recovery between activities was faster than expected for someone of her apparent fitness level. Most significantly, she maintained constant environmental awareness even during physically demanding activities. While other recruits focused entirely on their immediate tasks, Riley tracked personnel movements, monitored instructor positions, and processed ambient sounds that might indicate changing conditions or requirements. Drill instructor Staff Sergeant Williams had observed thousands of recruits during his 12 years of service. He possessed an intuitive ability to assess potential, identify hidden problems, and recognize unusual capabilities in personnel under his supervision. Riley's performance during physical training triggered his professional curiosity without providing clear explanations. Interesting technique on the obstacle course, he mentioned to Collins during a brief break between training rotations. Ashford completed the circuit in regulation time, but her approach was unusual. Very efficient movement patterns, minimal wasted energy, almost like she's done similar courses before. Collins nodded thoughtfully. I noticed the same thing during weapons maintenance. She handles equipment like someone with extensive experience, but her file shows standard basic training only. Makes you wonder about her background. Evening chow provided the most challenging test of Riley's ability to maintain her constructed anonymity. The mess hall buzzed with conversations that had been building throughout the day, speculation and analysis that grew more elaborate with each retelling of the previous night's events. Personnel who had never spoken to Riley found excuses to sit near her table, hoping to overhear something that might provide insight into her mysterious capabilities. She navigated the social minefield with characteristic precision, responding to direct questions with minimal but polite answers while avoiding any information that might compromise her carefully maintained persona. When asked about her background, she mentioned Iowa farmland and family circumstances that discouraged further inquiry. When questioned about training experience, she referenced standard military instruction and expressed satisfaction with supply duties. But the attention itself was problematic. Riley had spent months becoming invisible through consistent, unremarkable behavior. Now every action was scrutinized for hidden meaning, every response analyzed for clues about her true nature. The protective anonymity that had allowed her to maintain her constructed identity was dissolving under the weight of curiosity that she couldn't deflect without creating additional suspicion. As evening formation concluded and personnel dispersed to their quarters for personal time before lights out, Riley found herself walking alone across the parade ground toward the barracks complex. The familiar routine felt different now, charged with awareness that her period of invisibility had ended permanently. Tomorrow would bring additional scrutiny as word of the incident spread beyond immediate witnesses. Investigators would ask questions that required answers she preferred not to provide. Personnel would continue analyzing her behavior for evidence of capabilities that she had worked years to conceal. The constructed identity that had protected her for 3 years was beginning to crack under pressure she had hoped never to face again. The investigation into Sergeant Harrison's injuries began at 800 hours on Tuesday morning, exactly 18 hours after the incident that had left Fort Meridian's most feared drill instructor hospitalized with 3 fractured ribs and severe respiratory distress. Captain Jennifer Walsh from the military police had arrived before dawn, her crisp uniform and professional demeanor announcing that this was no routine inquiry into typical barracks conflicts. Riley received notification of her mandatory interview through official channels. a formal written order delivered by Corporal Stevens from the MP detachment. The document's bureaucratic language couldn't disguise its significance. She was being summoned as the primary subject of an investigation that could result in court-martial proceedings, criminal charges, or immediate discharge from military service. Ashford, report to Building 127 at 0830 hours for official questioning regarding Incident Report MP 2024-1847, Stevens announced in the supply depot's main workspace, his voice carrying across the cavernous warehouse where a dozen personnel pretended to focus on their assigned duties while straining to catch every word. The timing was deliberate. Morning shift change ensured maximum witnesses to Riley's summons, guaranteeing that news of the formal investigation would spread throughout Fort Meridian within hours. Military installations thrived on information, and official MP involvement transformed the previous evening's incident from barracks gossip into serious military business. Riley accepted the notification with the same composed expression she maintained during routine equipment requisitions. No surprise, no anxiety, no indication that being questioned about assault charges caused her any concern whatsoever. She simply nodded acknowledgement, completed her current inventory task with methodical precision, and prepared to comply with the order as if it were merely another administrative requirement. But her apparent calm was carefully constructed performance. Internally, Riley's mind was racing through contingency analyses, assessing potential outcomes, and preparing defensive strategies for questions she hoped wouldn't be asked. The investigation represented exactly the kind of official scrutiny she had spent 3 years avoiding, the type of focused attention that could uncover information she couldn't allow to surface. Building 127 housed Fort Meridian's military police headquarters, a sterile concrete structure designed for functionality rather than comfort. The interview room where Riley was directed contained standard institutional furniture, a metal table, 4 chairs, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in harsh shadows, and recording equipment that would preserve every word of the coming conversation for official analysis. Captain Walsh was already seated when Riley arrived, her posture radiating professional authority. At 38, Walsh had built her career on methodical investigation techniques and an ability to extract truth from personnel who preferred to avoid it. She had handled hundreds of similar cases during her 15 years of service, developing instincts that could detect deception, identify inconsistencies, and recognize when subjects possessed information they weren't revealing. Specialist Ashford, Walsh began, consulting a thick file that contained far more documentation than Riley's simple service record should have generated. Please state your full name and current assignment for the record. Riley Ann Ashford, Specialist, Supply Operations, Fort Meridian, Nevada, Riley replied, her voice maintaining the same unremarkable tone she used for routine communications. Walsh made notes in precise handwriting before continuing. Yesterday evening at approximately 247 hours, you were involved in a physical altercation with Sergeant Kane Harrison that resulted in significant injuries requiring emergency medical treatment. Describe the events leading up to this incident. Riley had prepared for this question during the sleepless hours between notification and interview. Her answer needed to satisfy official requirements without revealing capabilities that would generate additional investigation. The key was providing sufficient detail to appear cooperative while omitting information that might compromise her carefully constructed identity. Sergeant Harrison approached me near the equipment lockers in Barracks 7, she began, maintaining steady eye contact with Walsh. He began questioning my competence and suitability for military service, using language that I considered inappropriate. The situation escalated when he made physical contact. Define physical contact, Walsh interrupted, her pen poised above the legal pad where she was recording preliminary notes. He grabbed my shoulders and pushed me forcefully against the metal lockers, Riley replied. The impact was sufficient to cause pain and represent what I perceived as assault. Walsh nodded, making additional notations. And your response to this assault? This was the critical question, the moment where Riley's answer would determine whether the investigation concluded quickly or expanded into areas she couldn't allow. Her response needed to explain Harrison's injuries without suggesting capabilities beyond those of an ordinary supply clerk defending herself against unexpected attack. I reacted instinctively to defend myself, Riley said carefully. Sergeant Harrison was significantly larger and stronger than me. I felt threatened and responded with what I believed was necessary force to stop his aggressive behavior. Witnesses describe your defensive action as a strike to Harrison's ribcage that fractured 3 ribs and caused severe respiratory distress, Walsh observed, consulting testimony that had been collected from the 290 recruits who witnessed the incident. That represents substantial trauma for someone your size to inflict against someone Harrison's build. Riley had anticipated this line of questioning. Her answer needed to acknowledge the severity of Harrison's injuries, while providing plausible explanation that wouldn't trigger deeper investigation into her background or training. Fear and adrenaline can produce unexpected results, she replied. I didn't intend to cause serious injury. My only goal was stopping what I perceived as assault. The extent of Sergeant Harrison's injuries was unintentional. Walsh studied Riley's expression for signs of deception, applying techniques that had proven effective with thousands of previous subjects. But Riley's composure remained unshakable. No nervous gestures, no inconsistent eye contact, no verbal indicators that might suggest she was concealing important information. Multiple witnesses describe your movements as unusually fast and precise, Walsh continued. Several used terms like professional and trained to characterize your defensive technique. Do you have experience with martial arts, combat training, or self-defense instruction beyond standard military basic training? The question struck directly at information Riley couldn't reveal without compromising her entire constructed identity. Her background contained extensive training in disciplines that weren't listed in any official military records, capabilities that would immediately trigger investigation into how and where such skills had been acquired. I completed the same basic self-defense instruction as all military personnel, Riley answered, technically truthful while omitting crucial details. Sometimes people react more effectively than expected when they feel threatened. Walsh made additional notes, her expression suggesting that Riley's answers were plausible but incomplete. Experienced investigators developed intuition for subjects who provided technically accurate responses while concealing deeper truths. Riley was displaying all the characteristics of someone with information she preferred not to reveal. Specialist Ashford, Walsh said, shifting her approach to more direct confrontation. Sergeant Harrison outweighs you by approximately 90 pounds and has over 12 years of military experience, including combat deployments. Medical examination indicates his injuries are consistent with strikes delivered by someone with significant training in hand-to-hand combat techniques. Your explanation of instinctive defense doesn't adequately account for the precision and effectiveness of your response. Riley recognized that Walsh was pressing harder, attempting to force inconsistencies that might provide leverage for additional questioning. The investigation was reaching the point where continued deflection might create more suspicion than careful revelation of limited information. Captain Walsh, Riley replied, maintaining respectful but firm tone. I understand that the severity of Sergeant Harrison's injuries may seem inconsistent with my appearance and official background. However, I can only describe what occurred from my perspective. I was assaulted by someone significantly larger and stronger. I defended myself using whatever capabilities I possessed in that moment. The results were more severe than I intended, but my actions were justified given the circumstances. Walsh studied Riley's response carefully, recognizing that further pressure at this stage might be counterproductive. Her subject was maintaining consistent answers while providing plausible explanations for the incident. Without additional evidence suggesting criminal intent or excessive force, the investigation was reaching its preliminary limits. "We'll be conducting additional interviews with witnesses and reviewing medical reports," Walsh announced. "You're restricted to base pending completion of this investigation. Any attempt to leave Fort Meridian without authorization will result in additional charges. Do you understand these restrictions?" "Yes, Captain," Riley replied. "You're dismissed. Report any changes in your status or assignment through official channels." Riley stood, executed a perfect salute, and departed Building 127 with the same measured composure she had displayed throughout the interview. But as she walked back toward the supply depot, she was acutely aware that the investigation represented only the beginning of scrutiny that would intensify as word of the incident spread beyond Fort Meridian's boundaries. Within hours, her name would appear in official reports that might trigger automated searches of military databases. Personnel with longer memories might begin connecting details that could compromise the anonymity she had worked years to establish. The carefully constructed identity that had protected her was beginning to unravel under pressure she had hoped never to face. The investigation had concluded without immediate charges, but it had also marked the end of her invisibility and the beginning of a tension that could prove far more dangerous than any military prosecution. The news of Riley's restricted status spread through Fort Meridian like wildfire through dry grass, transforming her from invisible supply clerk into the most talked-about person on the entire installation. By Thursday afternoon, less than 48 hours after Captain Walsh's investigation began, personnel throughout the base were discussing theories about the quiet woman who had hospitalized Sergeant Harrison with what appeared to be a single, precisely delivered strike. In the mess hall during evening chow, Corporal Danny Morrison from the motor pool leaned across his table to address a group of combat engineers who had been debating the incident throughout their meal. Morrison was built like a linebacker, with hands the size of dinner plates, and a reputation for settling disputes through overwhelming physical presence. His assessment carried weight among personnel who respected strength and direct action. "I'm telling you guys, there's no way some tiny supply clerk takes down Kane Harrison without serious training," Morrison declared, stabbing his mashed potatoes with unnecessary force. "Harrison's been through Ranger School, served 3 combat tours, and probably outweighs her by 100 pounds. You don't accidentally fracture someone's ribs. That takes knowledge and precision." Private Lisa Chen, a communications specialist with 2 years of martial arts experience, shook her head skeptically. "Maybe she just got lucky. Adrenaline can make people do crazy things when they're scared. Harrison probably wasn't expecting any resistance from someone who looks like she couldn't hurt a butterfly." "Lucky?" Morrison laughed harshly. "Chen, I've seen lucky punches. This wasn't luck. Multiple witnesses said she barely moved, didn't even look like she was trying hard. That's muscle memory from serious training, not beginner's fortune." Sergeant Mike Torres, recently returned from deployment in Eastern Europe, had been listening to similar conversations throughout the day. Torres possessed the kind of combat experience that allowed him to recognize real capability when he encountered it, and the details emerging about Riley's confrontation with Harrison triggered professional curiosity that went beyond casual gossip. "You want my opinion?" Torres interjected, his voice carrying the authority that came from genuine battlefield experience. Ashford moves like someone with specialized training. I've worked with operators from different backgrounds, special forces, rangers, even some civilian contractors with interesting skill sets. She's got that same controlled awareness, like she's constantly processing potential threats and responses. The conversation paused as Riley herself entered the mess hall, moving through the serving line with the same unremarkable efficiency that had characterized her behavior for months. But now every step was observed by dozens of personnel who analyzed her movements for clues about her mysterious capabilities. The casual attention felt like searchlights, transforming routine activities into performance art that she couldn't escape. She selected her meal, standard military fare that required no special consideration, and scanned the dining area for seating options. Every table seemed to offer potential complications. Groups that had never acknowledged her existence now watched her approach with obvious curiosity. Personnel who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now studied her movements with the focused intensity of people trying to solve a puzzle. Riley chose an isolated table near the rear of the dining facility, hoping to minimize interactions while completing her meal quickly. But isolation proved impossible in an environment where she had become the primary topic of conversation throughout the installation. Within minutes, Private Jackson Williams approached her table with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting answers to his questions. Williams was a military police officer who had missed the previous evening's incident but heard detailed accounts from colleagues who witnessed it. His professional training made him particularly interested in the defensive capabilities that Riley had demonstrated. "Mind if I sit?" Williams asked, already pulling out the opposite chair without waiting for permission. "I wanted to ask about what happened with Harrison. The guys who were there said it was pretty impressive." Riley looked up from her meal with the same neutral expression she maintained during equipment requisitions. "It was an unfortunate situation that I prefer not to discuss." "Come on," Williams pressed, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone chasing an interesting story. "Harrison's been bullying people here for years. Nobody's ever stood up to him successfully. How'd you do it? Special training, martial arts background?" "I defended myself when I felt threatened," Riley replied, returning her attention to her food. "That's all there is to discuss." But Williams wasn't deterred by her obvious reluctance to engage. "Look, I've got friends in the MP detachment who saw the medical reports. Harrison's injuries weren't random. They were precise, targeted, professional. You hit him exactly where it would cause maximum damage while minimizing your own risk. That's not instinct. That's training." Riley set down her fork and fixed Williams with a direct stare that suddenly made him reconsider his aggressive questioning approach. For just a moment, her carefully maintained mask of unremarkable composure slipped, revealing something beneath that made experienced military personnel instinctively straighten their posture. "Private Williams," she said quietly, her voice carrying undertones that suggested he was approaching boundaries he didn't want to cross. "I've answered questions from the investigating officer through official channels. I'm not obligated to satisfy your curiosity through unofficial conversation. I suggest you return to your meal and allow me to complete mine." Williams felt an unexpected chill at her response, not from her words, which were perfectly polite, but from something in her tone and expression that suggested capabilities far beyond those of an ordinary supply clerk. He mumbled an apology and retreated to his original table, leaving Riley to finish her dinner in temporary peace. But the brief interaction had been observed by dozens of personnel throughout the mess hall, and Williams's retreat only fueled additional speculation about what he had encountered during their conversation. Within hours, embellished accounts of the exchange would spread throughout Fort Meridian, adding another layer to the growing legend surrounding Riley Ashford. The following morning brought new complications as personnel from other installations began arriving to conduct their own unofficial investigations. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos from Nellis Air Force Base had driven 4 hours to Fort Meridian after hearing second-hand accounts of the incident from colleagues in her intelligence unit. Santos possessed security clearances that allowed her access to classified databases, and something about the description of Riley's capabilities had triggered professional interest that went beyond casual curiosity. Santos located Riley in the supply depot during the morning equipment distribution period, observing her interactions with personnel requesting gear for training exercises. Riley's movements displayed the same efficient precision that had always characterized her work, but Santos noticed details that escaped less experienced observers. The way Riley positioned herself to maintain visual contact with all personnel in the workspace while appearing to focus on immediate tasks. How she processed multiple simultaneous requests without consulting reference materials or computer systems. The economy of movement that suggested training in disciplines where efficiency could mean survival. Most significantly, Santos recognized the controlled awareness that Riley maintained even during routine activities, the constant environmental scanning that indicated someone accustomed to operating in potentially hostile environments. "Excuse me, Specialist," Santos announced, approaching Riley's workstation with military bearing that immediately identified her as senior personnel despite being out of uniform. "I'm Staff Sergeant Santos, Intelligence Operations. Could I speak with you privately?" Riley looked up from the equipment inventory she was updating, studying Santos with careful assessment. Intelligence personnel rarely visited supply depots without specific reasons, and their interest typically indicated complications that she preferred to avoid. "I'm currently on duty, Sergeant," Riley replied respectfully. "Any official business should be coordinated through my chain of command." Santos smiled with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting cooperation through persistence rather than authority. "This isn't official business, Ashford. I'm here because certain details about your recent incident have triggered interest among people with longer memories than most military personnel possess." The statement carried implications that made Riley's pulse quicken, despite her outward composure. Intelligence operations meant access to databases and information sources that could compromise identities she had worked years to protect. Santos was suggesting connections to her past that shouldn't exist in any accessible records. "I'm not sure what you mean, Sergeant," Riley responded carefully. 3 years ago, there was an incident involving a classified operation that resulted in significant casualties and the disappearance of key personnel. Santos continued, her voice lowered to prevent eavesdropping from nearby workers. "Someone with your apparent capabilities and timeline of enlistment might have connections to that operation that would be of interest to ongoing investigations." Riley felt the careful construction of her new identity beginning to collapse under scrutiny she had hoped never to face. Intelligence personnel with access to classified information represented the greatest threat to the anonymity that had protected her since leaving her previous life. Santos was suggesting knowledge of events that could destroy everything she had built at Fort Meridian. "Sergeant Santos," Riley said quietly, "I think you've confused me with someone else. I'm a supply clerk from Iowa with no connection to classified operations or special assignments. My service record is available through standard channels if you'd like to verify my background." But Santos's expression suggested she wasn't convinced by Riley's deflection. Intelligence operations trained personnel to recognize deception and she was detecting inconsistencies that confirmed rather than dispelled her suspicions about Riley's true identity. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Webb, Riley's immediate supervisor, who noticed the unusual attention his supply clerk was receiving from senior personnel he didn't recognize. "Is there a problem here?" Webb asked, his protective instincts activated by the obvious tension between Santos and Riley. "No problem," Santos replied smoothly. "Just asking Specialist Ashford about equipment availability for an upcoming training exercise. Thank you for your time, Specialist. We'll be in touch." As Santos departed, Riley realized that her period of anonymity had definitively ended. Intelligence interest meant that her name would appear in databases that could trigger automated alerts among personnel, with knowledge of her previous identity. The careful construction that had protected her for 3 years was dissolving under pressure she had hoped never to face. The investigation into Harrison's injuries had been manageable. Intelligence attention represented an entirely different level of threat that could expose everything she had worked to conceal. The breakthrough came at 13:47 hours on Friday afternoon, when Master Sergeant David Reeves walked into Fort Meridian's main administrative building carrying a classified file folder that would change everything. Reeves was a 23-year veteran of Army Special Operations, whose weathered face and calculating eyes reflected decades of experience in places that didn't appear on official maps. He had driven 8 hours from Fort Bragg after receiving a priority alert that had been triggered by routine database searches related to the Harrison incident investigation. The alert had been automatic, a sophisticated algorithm designed to flag personnel whose capabilities or backgrounds might intersect with classified operations from previous years. Riley's name had appeared in the system not because of her official service record, which remained unremarkable, but because of biometric data that had been collected during her initial enlistment processing 3 years earlier. Fingerprints, facial recognition scans, and DNA samples that were standard procedure for all military personnel had finally connected to archived records from operations that were buried so deeply in classified systems that only a handful of personnel possessed access authorization. The connection had taken 3 years to surface because the search parameters were extraordinarily specific, designed to identify individuals who had completely disappeared from official records while maintaining new identities within military service. Reeves requested an immediate meeting with Fort Meridian's commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Morse, whose own security clearances were sufficient to receive the information he carried. The meeting took place in Morse's private office, a secure environment where conversations couldn't be monitored or recorded by unauthorized personnel. "Colonel," Reeves began, placing the file folder on Morse's desk with ceremonial precision, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention. One of your personnel has been operating under an assumed identity for the past 3 years, and recent events have compromised operational security protocols that were established to protect both the individual and national interests." Morse opened the folder and began reading documents that caused her expression to shift from professional curiosity to genuine shock. The file contained photographs, service records, and operational summaries that painted a picture of capabilities far beyond anything suggested by Riley Ashford's current assignment to supply operations. The photographs showed a woman in specialized tactical gear standing beside aircraft that were used for classified missions. The service records indicated training in disciplines that were taught only to elite personnel selected for operations requiring extraordinary skill and psychological resilience. The operational summaries described achievements that had saved lives and prevented disasters in circumstances that remained classified years after their completion. Jesus Christ, Morse whispered, studying a photograph that showed Riley receiving a commendation from military leadership whose names were redacted from the document. She's been serving coffee and distributing equipment for 3 years? Specialist Riley Ashford doesn't exist, Reeves explained. The identity was constructed as part of witness protection protocols after an operation went catastrophically wrong. The individual you know as Ashford was the sole survivor of a classified mission that resulted in multiple casualties and exposure of intelligence networks that took years to rebuild. Morse continued reading, absorbing details that explained everything about Riley's mysterious competence and her extreme desire for anonymity. The woman who had been invisible in her supply depot was actually someone whose real identity would trigger security protocols throughout multiple government agencies if it became known. What's her actual background? Morse asked, though the documents were already providing answers that seemed almost incredible. Major Alexandra Kane, former commander of Ghost Unit 7, one of the most classified special operations teams in military history, Reeves replied. She led missions in environments where conventional forces couldn't operate, specializing in situations that required precision, intelligence, and capabilities that couldn't be replicated through standard training programs. The name hit Morse like physical impact. Ghost Unit 7 was legendary within certain military circles, whispered about by personnel with sufficient clearance to know that such teams existed, but never discussed in detail because their operations touched on national security issues that remained sensitive years after completion. Kane was presumed dead after the Blackwater incident 3 years ago, Reeves continued. Officially, she died along with the rest of her unit when their operation was compromised by intelligence leaks that resulted in overwhelming enemy response. Unofficially, she survived but suffered psychological trauma that made returning to active duty impossible. Morse studied photographs that showed Major Alexandra Kane in her previous role. Confident, authoritative, clearly someone accustomed to command responsibility and life-or-death decision-making. The contrast with the quiet supply clerk she had observed around Fort Meridian was so dramatic that it seemed like evidence of different people entirely. The identity construction was necessary because Kane possessed knowledge of operations and intelligence sources that made her a permanent target, Reeves explained. Multiple foreign intelligence services and terrorist organizations would consider her elimination a priority objective if they discovered she had survived. Riley Ashford was created to allow her to disappear completely while remaining within military service where she could be monitored and protected. The implications began crystallizing in Morse's mind. Her unremarkable supply clerk was actually one of the most dangerous and valuable individuals in modern military history, someone whose real identity was protected by classification levels that exceeded her own security clearance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The incident with Sergeant Harrison has compromised her cover, Reeves continued. Personnel throughout Fort Meridian are asking questions about her capabilities. Intelligence officers from other installations are conducting unofficial investigations. Within days, someone with sufficient resources and motivation will connect Riley Ashford to Alexandra Kane, and when that happens, she becomes a target again. Morse closed the file folder, understanding that she was now responsible for decisions that could affect national security operations and individual safety in ways she had never anticipated. Her quiet supply clerk needed protection that went far beyond anything a typical military installation could provide. "What are my options?" Morse asked. "Limited," Reeves replied grimly. "We can attempt to reinforce her cover identity through disinformation and document modification, But that becomes increasingly difficult as more personnel become curious about her background. We can transfer her to a more secure location where her activities can be monitored more carefully, or we can bring her back into classified operations where her capabilities can be utilized properly. The third option carried implications that neither Morse nor Reeves wanted to discuss explicitly. Alexandra Kane's return to active duty would mean acknowledging that Ghost Unit 7's most successful operator had survived when official records stated she had died. It would require explanations that could compromise other ongoing operations and potentially expose intelligence sources that remained active in hostile territories. "Does she know we've identified her?" Morse asked. "Not yet, but Kane Ashford is extremely intelligent and professionally paranoid. She's undoubtedly aware that the Harrison incident has triggered scrutiny that threatens her anonymity. She may be preparing contingency plans that could include disappearing entirely from military service." Morse considered the ramifications of losing someone with Kane's capabilities and knowledge. If Riley decided to disappear again, she could potentially vanish so completely that even sophisticated intelligence resources couldn't locate her. But that would also mean losing oversight of someone whose knowledge made her both valuable and dangerous. "I need to speak with her," Morse decided. "Arrange a secure meeting where we can discuss options without compromising operational security or forcing decisions that might make the situation worse." Meanwhile, in the supply depot where this conversation was taking place, Riley was completing routine inventory tasks while maintaining heightened awareness of changes in her environment. She had noticed increased attention from personnel she didn't recognize, observed vehicles with government plates that weren't typical for Fort Meridian's normal operations, and detected the subtle signs that indicated official interest beyond routine investigation. Her instincts, honed through years of operating in environments where detection meant death, were warning her that the careful anonymity she had constructed was collapsing faster than she had anticipated. The Harrison incident had been manageable. Intelligence interest from Staff Sergeant Santos had been concerning, but the current level of activity suggested that people with real authority and access to classified resources were now focusing attention on her identity. Riley had prepared for this possibility during her 3 years at Fort Meridian, developing contingency plans that would allow her to disappear entirely if her cover was compromised. She possessed resources, contacts, and capabilities that weren't reflected in any official records, assets that could support a new identity in locations where military intelligence couldn't easily follow. But disappearing would mean abandoning the life she had built. Modest though it was, Fort Meridian had become home in ways she hadn't expected when first constructing her Riley Ashford identity. The work provided purpose, the routine offered stability, and the anonymity had allowed her to begin healing from psychological wounds that had seemed permanent after the Blackwater incident. As she completed her afternoon duties, Riley was acutely aware that decisions made by people she had never met would determine whether she could maintain the peaceful existence she had found, or whether she would be forced to return to a world of classified operations and constant danger that she had hoped never to experience again. The file folder in Colonel Morse's office contained enough information to destroy Riley Ashford completely, but it also held the potential for Alexandra Kane's return to a role where her extraordinary capabilities could serve purposes larger than equipment distribution and inventory management. The intersection of those possibilities would determine her future in ways that neither identity had been prepared to handle. The secure meeting was arranged for 1900 hours in Building 89, a nondescript concrete structure on Fort Meridian's eastern perimeter that housed classified briefing facilities designed for conversations that couldn't take place in standard administrative spaces. The room where Riley was directed contained sophisticated electronic countermeasures, signal blocking technology, and recording equipment that could be activated or disabled according to security protocols determined by the classification level of discussions taking place within its walls. Riley arrived precisely on time, her expression maintaining the same composed neutrality that had characterized her interactions since the Harrison incident began attracting unwanted attention. But internally, she was conducting rapid threat assessment and contingency planning that reflected training far more sophisticated than anything provided to supply personnel. The secure facility, unusual personnel activity, and formal notification procedures indicated that her carefully constructed anonymity had been compromised at levels that threatened everything she had built over the past 3 years. Colonel Morse was already seated when Riley entered, accompanied by Master Sergeant Reeves, whose presence immediately triggered recognition that sent ice through her veins. Reeves represented connections to her previous life that shouldn't have been possible if security protocols had been maintained properly. His weathered features and calculating expression were exactly as she remembered from briefings that had taken place in similar rooms years earlier, when she had been Major Alexandra Kane instead of Specialist Riley Ashford. "Specialist Ashford," Colonel Morse began, her voice carrying formal authority that suggested this conversation would follow official protocols despite taking place in a secure environment. "Please be seated. This meeting concerns matters that require security clearances above your current authorization level, but circumstances necessitate your participation in discussions that may affect your future assignment and status." Riley took the indicated chair while maintaining perfect military posture, but her eyes were focused on Reeves with intensity that reflected growing understanding of how thoroughly her anonymity had been penetrated. She had recognized him immediately despite 3 years of separation, just as she knew he had identified her through resources and databases that weren't supposed to contain any record of Riley Ashford's connection to classified operations. "Master Sergeant Reeves will be conducting this briefing," Morse continued. "You are authorized to speak freely about matters he raises, but information discussed in this room is classified at levels that make unauthorized disclosure a federal crime. Do you understand these restrictions?" "Yes, Colonel," Riley replied, though her attention remained fixed on Reeves as she waited for him to reveal exactly how much he knew about her real identity and the circumstances that had led to its concealment. Reeves opened the file folder he had carried from Fort Bragg, removing documents that Riley recognized even from across the table. Operational photographs showing her in tactical gear that belonged to her previous life, commendation certificates bearing her real name and rank, mission summaries that described achievements she had hoped never to remember in detail. "Major Alexandra Kane," Reeves said quietly, using her actual name for the first time in 3 years. "Commander of Ghost Unit 7 until the Blackwater incident resulted in the unit's official dissolution and your presumed death. Recipient of 3 Distinguished Service Crosses, 2 Purple Hearts, and commendations from intelligence agencies whose names remain classified. Specialist in operations requiring precision, intelligence, and capabilities that made you one of the most effective special operations officers in modern military history." Hearing her real name spoken aloud felt like physical impact. Riley Alexandra had spent so long inhabiting her constructed identity that being addressed by her actual rank and name created psychological displacement that required conscious effort to manage. The woman who had served coffee and distributed equipment was suddenly confronted with documentary evidence of someone she had tried to forget completely. "The Blackwater incident occurred 37 months ago," Reeves continued, consulting documents that contained details she remembered with crystalline clarity despite her efforts to suppress those memories. Ghost Unit 7 was conducting classified reconnaissance when intelligence leaks resulted in coordinated enemy response that killed 6 team members and left Major Kane as the sole survivor. Official records list her as killed in action to protect operational security and prevent enemy forces from targeting her for elimination. Colonel Morse studied Riley's expression as Reeves spoke, noting the subtle changes that indicated these weren't unfamiliar revelations but painful memories that had been deliberately buried. The quiet supply clerk was listening to her own biography being recited, and the emotional cost was evident despite her professional composure. The psychological evaluation conducted after your extraction recommended immediate medical discharge due to post-traumatic stress and survivor guilt that made you unsuitable for continued special operations. Reeves explained. However, your knowledge of classified operations, intelligence sources, and enemy capabilities made you too valuable and too dangerous to simply release into civilian life. The Riley Ashford identity was constructed to allow you to remain within military service while providing psychological distance from traumatic experiences. Riley finally spoke, her voice carrying undertones that hadn't been present during her months of anonymity at Fort Meridian. The construction was supposed to be permanent. My previous identity was supposed to remain buried to protect ongoing operations and prevent targeting by hostile intelligence services. It would have remained buried if you hadn't demonstrated capabilities that triggered automated security protocols, Reeves replied. The Harrison incident generated witness reports that described combat techniques consistent with advanced special operations training, database searches designed to identify personnel with unauthorized skills, flagged your biometric data for review. The explanation confirmed what Riley had suspected, that her moment of instinctive response to Harrison's assault had begun a cascade of official attention that was systematically dismantling the anonymity she had worked years to establish. The protective identity that had allowed her to heal from psychological wounds was being destroyed by the same capabilities it had been created to conceal. "What are my options?" Riley asked, though she suspected the answer would involve choices she preferred not to make. "Limited," Reeves admitted. "Your cover identity has been compromised beyond repair. Personnel throughout Fort Meridian are asking questions that will eventually lead to connections we can't prevent indefinitely. Intelligence officers from multiple agencies are conducting unofficial investigations that will produce results within days or weeks." Colonel Morse leaned forward, her expression indicating that she was about to address options that carried implications beyond Riley's personal situation. "We can attempt to construct a new identity and transfer you to a different installation where your capabilities won't attract attention. We can bring you back into classified operations where your skills can be utilized properly. Or we can arrange medical discharge and civilian placement with ongoing security monitoring." Each option represented fundamental changes that would destroy the life Riley had built at Fort Meridian. New identity meant starting over again with the constant fear that future exposure would trigger similar crisis. Return to active duty meant accepting responsibility for operations that had already cost her too much. Civilian discharge meant losing the structure and purpose that had become essential for her psychological stability. "There's a fourth option," Reeves added, his voice suggesting possibilities that hadn't been officially discussed, but were being considered by people with authority to make such decisions. Ghost Unit 7 was officially dissolved, but the need for personnel with your capabilities hasn't disappeared. There are ongoing operations that require someone with your specific background and training. you could return to active duty in a role that utilizes your skills while providing the security and support structure necessary to prevent the psychological issues that ended your previous service. The suggestion carried implications that made Riley's pulse quicken despite her outward composure. Returning to special operations would mean accepting missions similar to those that had resulted in the Blackwater incident. It would mean risking the lives of new team members and potentially repeating the traumatic experiences that had driven her into hiding. But it would also mean utilizing capabilities that had been dormant for 3 years, applying skills that had been developed through extraordinary training and experience to purposes that could genuinely protect lives and serve national interests. The quiet satisfaction she had found in supply operations paled in comparison to the sense of purpose that had defined her previous service. "I need time to consider these options," Riley said finally. "Time is limited," Reeves replied. "Intelligence attention is increasing daily. Within a week, your real identity will be known to people who shouldn't have access to that information. Decisions made in the next 72 hours will determine whether those revelations can be managed or whether they create security compromises that affect ongoing operations." As the meeting concluded and Riley was dismissed to consider options that would reshape her future, she realized that the quiet life she had built as Specialist Riley Ashford was ending regardless of which choice she made. The Harrison incident had triggered a cascade of consequences that would force her to confront both her past achievements and her carefully buried trauma in ways she had hoped never to experience again. The woman who had spent 3 years hiding from her own capabilities was about to discover whether those abilities could be reclaimed without destroying the psychological healing that had been purchased through complete anonymity. Major Alexandra Kane was returning whether Riley Ashford was ready or not. The classified file that Master Sergeant Reeves spread across the secure briefing table contained photographs and documents that told the story of Major Alexandra Kane's extraordinary military career, a narrative of achievement, sacrifice, and ultimately devastating loss that explained both her legendary capabilities and her desperate need for complete anonymity. The earliest photograph showed a young lieutenant fresh from West Point, her face displaying the confident optimism of someone who believed that dedication and skill could overcome any obstacle. Alexandra Kane had graduated in the top 5% of her class, earning recognition for both academic excellence and leadership potential that marked her for rapid advancement through increasingly specialized assignments. Her initial posting to Fort Benning's Ranger School had been followed by selection for Special Forces training at Fort Bragg, where her performance had attracted attention from recruitment officers for programs that didn't appear in official military career guides. The photographs documenting her progression showed subtle changes, increased confidence, developing tactical awareness, and the beginning of the controlled composure that would become her professional trademark. Major Kane's selection for Ghost Unit 7 occurred after she completed advanced training programs in surveillance, reconnaissance, direct action, and psychological operations, Reeves explained, indicating documents that contained performance evaluations written by instructors whose names remained classified years after their completion. Her psychological profile indicated exceptional stress tolerance, analytical capability, and decision-making capacity under extreme pressure. Ghost Unit 7 had been established to conduct operations in environments where conventional special operations forces couldn't operate effectively. Team members required capabilities that exceeded standard special forces training, advanced technical skills, linguistic ability, cultural knowledge, and psychological resilience that allowed them to function independently for extended periods while maintaining operational security in hostile territories. Alexandra had excelled in every aspect of the demanding preparation program. Her linguistic aptitude had resulted in fluency in 4 languages, plus conversational ability in 3 others. Her technical training had included advanced electronics, communications, and weapons systems that weren't taught to personnel below certain security clearances. Most importantly, her tactical judgment had proven consistently superior during simulated operations that tested decision-making capacity under conditions designed to replicate the psychological stress of actual combat. The operational photographs that followed showed Major Kane during actual missions, images that couldn't be described in detail due to ongoing security concerns, but which documented achievements that had prevented disasters, saved lives, and neutralized threats to national security in circumstances that required capabilities possessed by very few individuals. Operation Desert Shield, 18 months duration in Syria and Iraq, Reeves recited from mission summaries that contained more redacted text than readable content. Major Kane's team conducted reconnaissance and direct action missions that resulted in the elimination of terrorist leadership networks and the prevention of coordinated attacks against civilian targets in Europe and North America. The photographs from that deployment showed Alexandra in desert camouflage, her expression displaying the focused intensity of someone operating in constantly dangerous circumstances. She appeared older than her chronological age, her features reflecting the psychological toll of extended exposure to life-or-death decision-making and the responsibility for team members whose survival depended on her tactical leadership. Operation Iron Eagle, 12 months in Eastern Europe, Reeves continued. Counterintelligence operations that identified and neutralized foreign intelligence networks operating against NATO installations. Major Kane's team prevented the compromise of classified technology and eliminated threats that could have affected alliance security relationships. The mission summaries documented achievements that had earned Alexandra recognition from military leadership and intelligence agencies throughout the Allied community. Her tactical innovations had become standard procedures in special operations training programs. Her analytical methods had been incorporated into intelligence evaluation protocols. Her leadership techniques had been studied by personnel responsible for training future special operations officers. But the photographs also revealed subtle changes that indicated the cumulative psychological cost of sustained exposure to extreme stress. Alexandra's expression had become more guarded, her posture more cautious, her overall demeanor suggesting someone who had learned that survival required constant vigilance and emotional distance from circumstances that could change instantly from routine to catastrophic. Major Kane's final deployment was Operation Blackwater, conducted in Afghanistan's Paktika province, Reeves said, his voice carrying undertones that indicated this mission represented a turning point that had changed everything that followed. Ghost Unit 7 was tasked with conducting surveillance of suspected terrorist leadership meetings and providing intelligence for targeted elimination operations. The Blackwater deployment had begun as a routine reconnaissance mission, the kind of operation that Alexandra's team had completed successfully dozens of times during their previous assignments. Intelligence reports indicated that high-value targets were gathering in remote, mountainous terrain to coordinate attacks against civilian populations and military installations. Ghost Unit 7's assignment was to establish observation posts, gather photographic and electronic intelligence, and provide targeting information for precision strikes that would eliminate the threat without risking conventional military forces. The mission had proceeded according to established protocols for the first 3 weeks. Alexandra's team had successfully infiltrated the target area, established concealed observation positions, and begun collecting intelligence that confirmed the presence of personnel whose elimination would significantly disrupt terrorist operations. Their reports had provided information that would have prevented dozens of planned attacks and potentially saved hundreds of civilian lives. But on the 22nd day of the deployment, everything had changed with catastrophic suddenness. Intelligence leaks from sources that were never identified had revealed Ghost Unit 7's presence to the very personnel they were observing. The surveillance mission had become a trap, with Alexandra's team finding themselves surrounded by enemy forces whose numbers and coordination suggested advanced planning rather than chance discovery. What should have been a routine extraction had become a desperate fighting withdrawal against overwhelming odds. 6 team members killed in the first 30 minutes of contact. Reeves read from after-action reports that contained details too sensitive for complete disclosure. Major Kane managed tactical withdrawal while providing covering fire that allowed temporary escape and evasion. She maintained radio contact with extraction assets while conducting running firefight over 12 kilometers of mountainous terrain. The photographs from Alexandra's extraction showed someone who had been fundamentally changed by the experience. Her physical injuries were documented in clinical detail: shrapnel wounds, exhaustion, and exposure damage that required extensive medical treatment. But her psychological wounds were evident in ways that couldn't be quantified through standard medical examination. The woman who had led Ghost Unit 7 with confidence and tactical brilliance had become someone whose expression reflected the devastating understanding that her leadership decisions had resulted in the death of 6 soldiers who had trusted her judgment completely. The survivor guilt was evident in every photograph taken during her recovery period, transforming her features in ways that made her previous confidence seem like evidence of naivety rather than professional competence. Post-incident psychological evaluation indicated severe post-traumatic stress, survivor guilt, and cognitive patterns consistent with individuals who had experienced traumatic loss of personnel under their command, Reeves explained. Military psychiatrists recommended immediate medical discharge due to psychological unfitness for continued special operations duty. The evaluation reports documented someone who had lost the essential psychological characteristics that made special operations service possible. Alexandra's tactical judgment remained sound, her technical skills remained intact, but her ability to accept responsibility for team members' lives had been destroyed by the Blackwater experience. The confidence that had carried her through years of successful operations had been replaced by paralyzing awareness of how quickly competent leadership could result in catastrophic loss. The decision to create the Riley Ashford identity was made to protect both Major Kane's psychological recovery and operational security regarding Ghost Unit 7's activities. Reeves concluded, her knowledge of classified operations made civilian discharge impossible, but her psychological state made continued special operations service equally impossible. The constructed identity allowed her to remain within military service while providing complete separation from traumatic experiences. Colonel Morse studied the final photographs in the file, images showing Alexandra during her identity construction process, her features gradually being altered through minor cosmetic procedures and her overall appearance being modified to create someone who bore only general resemblance to the confident special operations officer she had been. The transformation was subtle but complete, designed to allow her to disappear entirely while remaining within the military structure that provided the security and purpose necessary for her psychological healing. Riley Ashford was created to be permanently anonymous, Morse observed. Someone whose capabilities would never be tested, whose background would never be questioned, whose identity would never attract the kind of attention that could trigger connections to classified operations. The construction was successful for 3 years, Reeves agreed. But the Harrison incident demonstrated capabilities that the Riley Ashford identity was designed to conceal. Once those abilities became evident, automated security protocols began connecting biometric data to archived records that couldn't be completely erased. As Riley absorbed the recitation of her own history, achievements she had tried to forget, trauma she had hoped never to revisit, and decisions that had shaped her current situation in ways she was only beginning to understand, she realized that the careful separation between her past and present identities was collapsing beyond any possibility of repair. Major Alexandra Kane's extraordinary capabilities and devastating psychological wounds were about to be inherited by someone who had spent 3 years learning to be ordinary. The transformation began at 600 hours on Monday morning, when Colonel Morse issued orders that fundamentally altered the dynamics at Fort Meridian. Riley Ashford's temporary duty assignment to supply operations was officially terminated, replaced by reassignment to the base commander's Special Projects Division, a designation that existed primarily to provide administrative cover for personnel whose actual duties couldn't be described through standard military occupational specialties. The change was announced through official channels that reached every department head simultaneously, ensuring that speculation about Riley's mysterious capabilities would be replaced by official recognition of her special status. The memorandum was carefully worded to avoid classified information while making clear that her new assignment reflected expertise that exceeded her apparent background. Effective immediately, Specialist Riley Ashford is reassigned from Supply Operations to Special Projects Division under direct command authority. All personnel are directed to extend appropriate courtesy and cooperation to Specialist Ashford in the execution of her assigned duties. Questions regarding this reassignment should be directed through official channels only. The announcement created immediate ripple effects throughout Fort Meridian, as personnel who had been speculating about Riley's background suddenly found their theories validated by official action. Supply clerks weren't typically reassigned to special projects divisions. Personnel with unremarkable service records didn't receive direct command attention. The administrative change confirmed that their quiet colleague possessed qualifications that far exceeded her apparent role. In the supply depot where Riley had worked for 3 months, the news was received with a mixture of vindication and bewilderment. Sergeant Webb, who had supervised her section, gathered his remaining personnel to address questions that had been building since the Harrison incident first attracted widespread attention. "I don't know what Ashford's actual background is," Webb announced to the assembled supply staff, "but I can tell you that her work performance was consistently exceptional. Whatever qualifications led to this reassignment were evident in everything she did, even if we didn't recognize them at the time." Corporal Sarah Valdez, who had attempted to include Riley in social activities during her first weeks at Fort Meridian, shook her head with rueful recognition. "She always moved like someone with serious training. I thought she was just naturally coordinated, but looking back, everything about her suggested capabilities we never suspected." The reassignment also triggered official recognition from personnel who had observed Riley's capabilities without fully understanding their implications. Staff Sergeant Williams, the drill instructor who had noted her unusual technique during physical training, submitted a formal report documenting his observations for inclusion in her updated service record. Specialist Ashford demonstrated movement patterns and tactical awareness consistent with advanced training during routine conditioning exercises, Williams wrote. Her performance exceeded standard requirements while maintaining careful control to avoid drawing attention to exceptional capabilities. Professional assessment indicates extensive background in specialized military disciplines. Similar reports began arriving from throughout Fort Meridian as instructors, supervisors, and colleagues documented observations that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but gained significance in light of recent revelations. The accumulated testimony painted a picture of someone whose every action had reflected training and experience that far exceeded her official background. But the most significant recognition came from personnel whose own experience allowed them to accurately assess what they had witnessed. Master Sergeant Torres, the combat veteran who had served multiple deployments in hostile territories, requested permission to submit a classified assessment that would become part of Riley's permanent record. Having observed Specialist Ashford's response to threatening situations and her general conduct during routine operations, it is my professional opinion that she possesses training and experience consistent with Special Operations background, Torres wrote in his official evaluation. Her tactical awareness, physical capabilities, and psychological composure indicate someone who has operated in high-stress environments requiring exceptional skill and judgment. The stream of recognition reports created a comprehensive documentation of capabilities that the Riley Ashford identity had been designed to conceal. 3 years of careful anonymity were being systematically dismantled as colleagues, instructors, and supervisors recorded observations that collectively revealed someone far more qualified than her official service record suggested. Meanwhile, Riley was adapting to her new assignment with the same methodical approach she had applied to supply operations. Her office in the Special Projects Division was located in Building 127, the same facility that housed military police headquarters, a placement that provided both security and administrative convenience for personnel whose duties might require coordination with law enforcement or intelligence agencies. The space was larger than her previous workspace, equipped with secure communications systems and document storage facilities that indicated her new role would involve information requiring enhanced protection protocols. Most significantly, her computer terminal provided access to databases and networks that weren't available to standard military personnel, suggesting that her responsibilities would extend beyond routine administrative tasks. Colonel Morse conducted Riley's initial briefing personally, establishing the parameters for her new role while avoiding specific details that might compromise ongoing operations or security protocols. The conversation took place in the same secure briefing room where Master Sergeant Reeves had revealed her true identity, ensuring that sensitive information remained protected. Your assignment to Special Projects Division provides administrative cover for duties that can't be described through standard job classifications, Morse explained. Your actual responsibilities will be determined by operational requirements and your specific qualifications, which are now officially recognized despite not appearing in conventional service records. Riley understood that her new position represented a compromise between her desire for continued anonymity and the military's need to acknowledge capabilities that could no longer be ignored. She would remain within the military structure that had provided stability during her psychological recovery, but her role would inevitably involve utilization of skills she had hoped never to employ again. What specific duties will be required? Riley asked, though she suspected the answer would involve gradual reintroduction to responsibilities similar to those she had handled as Major Alexandra Kane. Initially, consulting and analysis work, Morse replied. Your experience and training make you qualified to evaluate operational plans, assess security protocols, and provide guidance on matters requiring specialized knowledge. The goal is to utilize your capabilities while avoiding the kind of field operations that proved psychologically problematic in your previous service. The arrangement represented careful balance between institutional needs and individual limitations. Riley's expertise would be applied to support ongoing operations, without requiring her to assume direct responsibility for team members' lives. The aspect of Special Operations Service that had proven psychologically devastating after the Blackwater incident. Over the following days, Riley's new status became evident throughout Fort Meridian as personnel adjusted to interacting with someone whose official recognition had transformed her from invisible supply clerk to acknowledged specialist. The change was subtle but pervasive, affecting everything from casual conversations to formal military protocols. Junior personnel who had previously ignored her presence now offered respectful greetings when encountering her in hallways or common areas. Senior staff who had never acknowledged her existence began seeking her input on matters that required specialized knowledge. Even personnel who hadn't witnessed the Harrison incident directly had learned enough about her background to recognize that she possessed qualifications worthy of professional respect. The transformation was most evident during her first appearance at the weekly staff meeting where department heads coordinated activities and shared information relevant to Fort Meridian's operations. Riley's attendance at the meeting marked official recognition that her expertise was considered valuable for institutional planning and decision-making processes. Specialist Ashford will be providing analysis and consultation on matters requiring specialized operational knowledge, Colonel Morse announced to the assembled staff. Her background and experience make her qualified to evaluate security protocols, assess tactical planning, and provide guidance on issues that benefit from advanced training perspectives. The introduction was met with respectful acknowledgement from personnel who had learned enough about Riley's capabilities to understand that her inclusion in senior staff meetings reflected genuine expertise rather than administrative convenience. Department heads who had previously viewed her as unremarkable support personnel now recognized someone whose assessment could influence operational decisions and institutional policies. But the most significant recognition came from unexpected sources. Sergeant Harrison, recently released from medical treatment for the injuries sustained during their confrontation, submitted a formal statement that acknowledged the professional competence of Riley's defensive response while accepting responsibility for initiating the physical altercation. Specialist Ashford's defensive actions were appropriate given the circumstances I created through inappropriate physical contact, Harrison wrote in his official statement. Her response demonstrated training and capability that I failed to recognize, and I accept full responsibility for the incident that resulted from my unprofessional conduct. The statement represented remarkable acknowledgement from someone whose reputation had been built on dominance and intimidation. Harrison's recognition of Riley's professional competence provided official validation that her capabilities were genuine rather than accidental, confirming assessments that had been building throughout Fort Meridian since the incident first occurred. As Riley settled into her new role, she realized that the anonymity she had treasured for 3 years was being replaced by recognition that felt both validating and dangerous. Her carefully constructed identity as an unremarkable supply clerk had been permanently destroyed, but the acknowledgement of her actual capabilities provided professional satisfaction that she had almost forgotten was possible. The woman who had hidden from her own skills was beginning to discover whether those abilities could be reclaimed without triggering the psychological devastation that had driven her into hiding. 3 months after her reassignment to the Special Projects Division, Riley had established a new equilibrium at Fort Meridian that represented a careful balance between her desire for anonymity and the institutional need to utilize her extraordinary capabilities. Her daily routine now included responsibilities that would have been impossible for Specialist Riley Ashford, but came naturally to someone with Major Alexandra Kane's background and training. Her primary assignment involved reviewing and analyzing operational security protocols for training exercises that simulated real-world deployment scenarios. The work required capabilities that few personnel possessed: understanding of threat assessment methodologies, knowledge of adversary tactics and capabilities, and experience with the kind of high-stakes decision-making that could determine mission success or catastrophic failure. Riley approached these responsibilities with the same methodical precision that had characterized her supply operations work, but now her expertise was being applied to problems that actually challenged her analytical abilities. She reviewed training scenarios developed by personnel with conventional military experience, identifying vulnerabilities and tactical oversights that could prove fatal in actual operational environments. Her recommendations were consistently sophisticated and actionable. Training exercises that had been designed to test standard military capabilities were enhanced through modifications that reflected real-world complexities experienced during classified operations. Scenario parameters were adjusted to include psychological stress factors, communication challenges, and decision-making pressures that better prepared personnel for deployment to hostile territories. The impact of Riley's contributions became evident during training evaluations that showed dramatically improved performance among units whose exercises had been modified according to her recommendations. Personnel who completed her enhanced scenarios demonstrated better tactical judgment, superior stress tolerance, and more effective leadership under pressure than their counterparts who participated in standard training programs. Colonel Morse recognized the value of Riley's work during monthly performance reviews that documented achievements far exceeding typical analyst contributions. Your modifications to training protocols have produced measurable improvements in unit readiness, Morse noted in Riley's official evaluation. Personnel who complete exercises designed according to your recommendations consistently outperform their peers in stress tolerance and tactical decision-making. But Riley's influence extended beyond formal training modifications. Her presence at Fort Meridian had begun affecting the institutional culture in subtle but significant ways. Personnel who interacted with her professionally began adopting behavioral patterns that reflected higher standards of tactical awareness and operational security. Junior officers sought her informal guidance on leadership challenges, recognizing that her calm demeanor and thoughtful responses indicated experience with command responsibilities that exceeded their own. Senior staff consulted her on security matters that required understanding of adversary capabilities and operational methodologies that weren't taught in standard military education programs. Most significantly, Riley had become an unofficial mentor for personnel who demonstrated potential for advanced assignments. Her ability to recognize capability and provide developmental guidance was attracting attention from career counselors who referred promising soldiers for consultation about specialized training opportunities. The mentoring relationships developed naturally through her daily interactions with personnel whose questions revealed aptitude for responsibilities beyond their current assignments. Riley's responses were carefully calibrated to provide guidance without revealing classified information, but her assessments consistently identified individuals whose potential had been overlooked by conventional evaluation methods. Sergeant Patricia Hawkins, a military police officer who had demonstrated exceptional analytical ability during investigations, became one of Riley's most frequent consultation subjects. Hawkins possessed the kind of systematic thinking and attention to detail that suggested potential for intelligence operations, but her background and current assignment hadn't provided opportunities to develop or demonstrate such capabilities. You have observational skills that exceed normal requirements for your current role, Riley told Hawkins during one of their informal conversations. Have you considered pursuing training opportunities that might utilize your analytical capabilities more effectively? The suggestion led to Hawkins applying for intelligence specialist training, an assignment path that would never have occurred to her without Riley's encouragement. Similar conversations with other personnel resulted in career decisions that better matched individual capabilities with institutional needs, creating a pattern of professional development that enhanced Fort Meridian's overall operational effectiveness. Riley's influence was also evident in the way personnel approached problem-solving challenges throughout the installation. Her methodical approach to analysis and her emphasis on systematic evaluation of alternatives had begun affecting decision-making processes in departments that had no direct contact with her work. The changes were subtle but pervasive. Meetings were conducted with greater attention to comprehensive information gathering. Plans were developed with more thorough consideration of potential complications and contingency requirements. Personnel at all levels demonstrated increased awareness of security considerations and operational factors that might affect mission success. Fort Meridian's commanding staff noted these improvements during quarterly assessments that evaluated institutional performance against standard military benchmarks. Training efficiency had increased, security violations had decreased, and personnel satisfaction had improved in ways that correlated with Riley's growing influence throughout the installation. But the most significant change involved the way personnel understood their own capabilities and potential for advancement. Riley's presence had created an environment where individual excellence was recognized and developed rather than overlooked or discouraged. Personnel who had accepted limited roles within the military structure began pursuing opportunities for specialized training and advancement that better utilized their abilities. The transformation was particularly evident among female personnel who had encountered subtle barriers to advancement in military environments dominated by traditional masculine hierarchies. Riley's demonstration of professional competence, despite her unremarkable appearance, had inspired confidence among women who had previously accepted limitations on their career aspirations. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, an intelligence officer who had been considering leaving military service due to frustration with advancement opportunities, credited Riley's example with encouraging her to pursue specialized training that led to assignment with strategic intelligence operations. Seeing what Specialist Ashford accomplished while maintaining professional composure showed me that exceptional capability doesn't require aggressive self-promotion, Chen explained. Similar testimonials from other personnel documented the inspirational impact of Riley's professional approach and quiet competence. Her demonstration that extraordinary ability could coexist with modest demeanor had challenged assumptions about leadership styles and career advancement that had limited opportunities for personnel whose natural personalities didn't conform to traditional military stereotypes. The recognition extended beyond Fort Meridian's boundaries as other installations began requesting consultation on training modifications and operational assessments. Riley's reputation for insightful analysis and practical recommendations had spread through professional networks that connected special operations communities across multiple military services. Her expertise was particularly valued for pre-deployment training programs that prepared personnel for operations in environments where conventional military doctrine provided insufficient guidance. Units scheduled for assignment to hostile territories requested access to training scenarios that had been enhanced according to Riley's recommendations, recognizing that such preparation could prove essential for mission success and personnel survival. The demand for her expertise created scheduling challenges that required careful coordination to balance her Fort Meridian responsibilities with consultation requests from other installations. Colonel Morse found herself managing a resource whose capabilities were increasingly recognized throughout the military community as uniquely valuable for specialized training and operational planning. Your reputation has begun attracting attention that exceeds local institutional needs, Morse informed Riley during one of their regular coordination meetings. We're receiving requests for consultation services that would require temporary duty assignments to other installations. The expansion of her responsibilities represented both recognition of her expertise and potential complications for the careful balance she had established between professional utilization and personal security. Increased visibility throughout military networks meant greater risk that her true identity might be discovered by personnel whose knowledge of classified operations could connect Riley Ashford to Major Alexandra Kane. But it also provided opportunities to apply her capabilities to purposes that genuinely served national security interests, while avoiding the direct command responsibilities that had proven psychologically devastating during her previous service. The consulting and analysis work allowed her to contribute specialized knowledge without assuming responsibility for tactical decisions that could result in casualties. As Riley evaluated requests for expanded consultation services, she realized that her careful reconstruction of professional identity had reached a critical juncture. The anonymous supply clerk who had hidden from her own capabilities was being offered opportunities to serve at levels that approached her previous responsibilities as a special operations officer. The choice would determine whether she could continue managing the psychological wounds from her past while applying her expertise to purposes larger than institutional training programs, or whether increased professional visibility would ultimately compromise the security and stability that had made her recovery possible. The woman who had spent 3 years learning to be ordinary was discovering that exceptional ability couldn't remain hidden indefinitely when institutional needs required capabilities that few personnel possessed. 2 years had passed since the Harrison incident shattered Riley's carefully constructed anonymity, transforming her from an invisible supply clerk into one of Fort Meridian's most respected specialists. The woman who had once hidden behind equipment requisitions and inventory sheets now commanded attention in briefing rooms, where senior officers sought her expertise on matters that could determine the success or failure of critical operations. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Riley's reputation had spread throughout military networks as someone whose analytical capabilities and operational insights exceeded conventional training programs. Her consulting work had expanded to include pre-deployment assessments for units heading to hostile territories, security evaluations for classified facilities, and training modifications that had saved lives in combat zones across 3 continents. But the most significant change wasn't professional, it was personal. The psychological wounds that had driven Major Alexandra Kane into hiding had begun to heal through the careful application of her skills to purposes that served others without requiring her to assume direct responsibility for life-or-death tactical decisions. She had found a way to honor her capabilities while avoiding the command responsibilities that had proven psychologically devastating. The office she now occupied in Building 127 reflected her evolved status at Fort Meridian. Multiple computer terminals provided access to classified databases and communication networks that connected her to ongoing operations worldwide. Wall-mounted displays showed global threat assessments and operational summaries that required her specialized knowledge to interpret and analyze. The workspace resembled a strategic planning center more than a conventional military office. Her daily schedule included briefings with personnel preparing for deployments to regions where her experience could prove essential for survival. Young officers sought her guidance on leadership challenges, that required understanding of psychological factors and tactical considerations that weren't taught in standard military academies. Intelligence analysts consulted her on threat assessments that benefited from her knowledge of adversary capabilities and operational methodologies. The work provided deep satisfaction that reminded Riley why she had originally chosen military service. Her expertise was being applied to protect personnel who faced dangers she understood intimately, preventing the kind of catastrophic losses that had destroyed her previous unit. Each successful deployment, each tactical modification that improved survival rates, each training enhancement that better prepared soldiers for hostile environments represented validation that her capabilities could serve constructive purposes. The healing process hadn't eliminated her psychological scars from the Blackwater incident, but it had transformed them from crippling trauma into meaningful motivation. The memory of losing 6 team members under her command would always cause pain, but that pain now drove her to ensure that other commanders had the knowledge and preparation necessary to avoid similar disasters. Colonel Morse had observed Riley's psychological recovery with professional satisfaction and personal admiration. The broken woman who had constructed the Riley Ashford identity to escape traumatic memories had evolved into someone who could acknowledge her past while building a sustainable future. The integration of her authentic capabilities with her need for emotional stability represented remarkable personal growth under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Your work has prevented casualties that we'll never be able to quantify, Morse told Riley during their final coordination meeting before Morse's transfer to Pentagon assignment. Units that have benefited from your training modifications and operational assessments have achieved mission success with significantly reduced losses. That represents lives saved through the application of expertise that might have remained unused if you hadn't found the courage to embrace your capabilities again. The recognition meant more to Riley than formal commendations or advancement opportunities, knowing that her experience and knowledge were actively protecting personnel who faced the same dangers that had devastated her previous unit, provided purpose that transcended personal career considerations. She had discovered that healing didn't require forgetting traumatic experiences. It required transforming them into wisdom that could prevent others from suffering similar losses. The anniversary of the Harrison incident had passed without significant notice, but Riley marked the date privately as the beginning of her return to authentic professional identity. The terrified woman who had responded instinctively to physical assault had unknowingly begun a process of reclaiming capabilities that had been buried under layers of constructed anonymity and psychological protection. Her relationship with Harrison himself had evolved into mutual professional respect that surprised everyone familiar with their initial confrontation. Harrison had requested transfer to Riley's training enhancement program after completing medical recovery, seeking to understand the capabilities he had encountered and learn from someone whose expertise exceeded his own experience. I spent 12 years thinking that intimidation and physical dominance were the most effective leadership tools, Harrison admitted during one of their professional consultations. Watching you work has taught me that quiet competence and analytical thinking produce better results than aggressive confrontation. The transformation of their relationship from violent conflict to professional collaboration represented broader changes in Fort Meridian's institutional culture. Personnel throughout the installation had learned to recognize and value capabilities that didn't conform to traditional military stereotypes, creating an environment where diverse forms of excellence could flourish. Riley's influence had been particularly significant for female personnel who had encountered barriers to advancement in military environments that favored conventional, masculine leadership styles. Her demonstration that extraordinary capability could coexist with modest demeanor had inspired confidence among women who had previously accepted limitations on their career aspirations. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Walsh, who had conducted the original investigation into Harrison's injuries, credited Riley's example with encouraging her to pursue command opportunities that she had previously considered beyond her reach. Seeing what Specialist Ashford accomplished while maintaining professional composure showed me that effective leadership doesn't require aggressive self-promotion or intimidation tactics. Similar testimonials from personnel throughout Fort Meridian documented the inspirational impact of Riley's professional approach and quiet competence. Her success had challenged assumptions about advancement and leadership that had limited opportunities for individuals whose natural personalities didn't conform to traditional military expectations. The legacy extended beyond personal inspiration to institutional improvements that enhanced Fort Meridian's overall effectiveness. Training programs had been fundamentally enhanced through Riley's modifications, producing personnel better prepared for deployment challenges. Security protocols had been strengthened through her assessments, reducing vulnerabilities that could have compromised operational success. Decision-making processes had been improved through adoption of analytical methodologies that reflected her systematic approach to problem-solving. But perhaps the most significant impact involved changing perceptions about the potential that existed within seemingly ordinary personnel. Riley's transformation from invisible supply clerk to acknowledged specialist had demonstrated that exceptional capability often remained hidden until circumstances required its revelation. Personnel throughout Fort Meridian had learned to look beyond surface appearances and conventional qualifications to recognize potential that might not be immediately evident. The institutional culture had evolved to value diverse forms of excellence, creating opportunities for advancement based on actual capability rather than traditional career progression patterns. As Riley prepared for her next assignment, a consulting role that would allow her to apply her expertise to operational planning at the strategic level, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the psychological devastation of the Blackwater incident to her current position of professional respect and personal stability. The woman who had once believed that her military career had ended in catastrophic failure had discovered that her most significant contributions lay ahead rather than behind her. The capabilities that had been forged through years of specialized training and refined through traumatic experience were now being applied to purposes that honored both her expertise and her commitment to protecting others. Major Alexandra Kane's extraordinary skills would continue serving national security interests, but they would be wielded by someone who had learned to balance professional excellence with psychological sustainability. The integration of her authentic capabilities with her need for emotional stability represented not just personal recovery, but evolution into someone whose contributions exceeded anything she had achieved during her previous service. The quiet woman who had hidden behind supply requisitions had become someone whose expertise would influence military operations for years to come, proving that true strength often emerged not from avoiding challenges, but from finding ways to transform traumatic experiences into wisdom that could protect and empower others. In conference rooms across the globe, military planners would benefit from insights that had been purchased through devastating loss, but refined into knowledge that could prevent future tragedies. Riley's story had become more than personal redemption. It had become proof that exceptional individuals could find ways to serve purposes larger than themselves, even when those purposes required confronting the deepest sources of their pain. The woman who had fractured Harrison's ribs in an instant of defensive reaction had ultimately fractured assumptions about capability, recovery, and the hidden potential that existed within people whose true strength remained invisible until circumstances demanded its revelation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.